Solomon Vance was 36 years old the night his wife looked across a dinner table full of her friends and said the words that ended 12 years of silence on his part. It was a Saturday in October in Nashville, Tennessee. They were at a restaurant she had chosen, with people she had chosen, celebrating a promotion she had received at a company he had quietly helped her get into. The table was loud with wine and laughter and the easy cruelty of people who have decided, collectively, that one person in the room does not have to be treated with care. Her friends had always treated him as optional furniture, a man-shaped placeholder in Vanessa's otherwise well-curated life. He was used to it. He had been used to it for years. He drove a truck that was not impressive. He wore clothes that were not a statement. He smiled when spoken to and excused himself when not needed, and asked for nothing from anyone at that table except, occasionally, the breadbasket. The comment came after someone asked, not for the first time, how Vanessa had landed the new position. She had said it was a combination of timing and knowing the right people. Then she had glanced at Solomon once, the way you glanced at a lamp in a corner, and she had said, to the table, not to him, "I've made better decisions drunk at 2 a.m. than I made when I married him." Laughter, someone said. "Even your mistakes are better than you." And Vanessa had smiled and said, "Yes, exactly." Solomon had set his fork down. He had not said a word. He had folded his napkin. He had finished his water. He had excused himself from the table with the same quiet courtesy he gave everyone, including people who did not deserve it, and he had gone to the parking lot and he had sat in his truck for 11 minutes. What Vanessa did not know, what not a single person at that table had thought to ask, not once in the years they had orbited his silence, was what Solomon Vance had been doing with himself for the past decade and a half. Not the truck, not the work clothes, not the modest apartment they shared in East Nashville, the one he'd been paying the lease on for 3 years while she saved for what she'd told him was an investment account. She had no idea what the investment account actually was, or who had set it up, or what it was preparing for. What happened in the weeks that followed would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would be the quietest demolition she had ever seen. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. That same morning had started the way Solomon's mornings always started, before the evening came and rearranged everything. He was up at 5:15. The apartment was dark and still. He made coffee in the French press his grandmother had brought back from a church trip to New Orleans 30 years ago. Ceramic, slightly chipped at the spout, the kind of object that accumulated meaning through use rather than display. He stood at the kitchen counter while it steeped and looked out at the Nashville skyline going pale at its edges and thought about nothing in particular. The way a man thinks when he is entirely at peace with the early morning and entirely uncertain about the evening ahead. He was a licensed master electrician, not a glamorous title at a dinner party. The kind of trade that made certain people at certain tables ask only 1 or 2 polite questions before redirecting the conversation towards someone whose work was easier to admire from the outside. What it actually meant was that he had spent 15 years learning to read the hidden architecture of buildings, the current running through walls, the load on circuits, the points of failure that could not be seen by the untrained eye, but were always, always there. He was exceptionally good at it. He ran his own small outfit, 4 electricians and an office manager, and had for the past 7 years. His grandmother, his father's mother, Loretta, who had raised him in Clarksville after his parents separated and had not once, in all her years, apologized for who she was, had a saying she kept on a piece of paper tucked into her Bible: "Silence is not the same as empty." She had explained it to him once when he was about 14 and feeling invisible in the way that 14-year-olds could feel invisible, and he had not fully understood it until much later. She had passed 4 years ago, in January, quietly, the way she had lived. He kept the piece of paper in his wallet. Vanessa had been asleep when he left for the job site that morning. She was asleep more often than not when he left. She had begun, in the last year or so, to treat their shared life as two parallel operations with occasional overlap, her trajectory ascending, his presumed to be static. He had noticed. He had not commented. He was a man who watched the wiring before he touched it. He had met her at a friend's 4th of July party in 2013. She had been working entry-level in marketing, sharp and restless, with the particular energy of someone who was certain they were meant for more and had not yet figured out where more was located. He had liked that restlessness. He had liked, that first night, that she had asked him what his work actually involved, and listened to the answer rather than waiting for her turn to speak. He had liked that she challenged the premise of a conversation rather than simply joining it. He had misread, over time, what she was restless toward. They had dated for 2 years and married in the fall of 2015 in a ceremony that her mother had organized, and his grandmother had attended in a yellow dress that became the best photograph of the day. In his grandmother's face in that photograph was something he could only identify in retrospect. Not worry, exactly, but a quality of attention. The careful attention of a woman watching a circuit she had some private concern about. The job site that Saturday morning was a commercial build in Germantown, a restaurant gut and rebuild where Solomon's crew was doing the full electrical. He walked the space twice before the crew arrived, tracing the conduit runs in his head, checking the panel schedule against the architect's revised drawings, finding the 2 places where the specs didn't match the structural reality, and making the notes that would save his client 3 days of rework. He did this the way he always did, methodically, without ceremony, without needing anyone to observe it. At 11:15, his phone buzzed. A text from his financial advisor, Reginald Poole. Available to talk today? Got the audit back. Solomon typed after 2. He went back to reading the panel schedule. He finished the walkthrough. He drove home and changed and took his wife to dinner. And then it was evening, and then it was the parking lot, and then it was the 11 minutes, and then it was the drive home in silence. Vanessa talking about dessert and the new restaurant district and whether they should get a dog. And Solomon watching the road and saying the minimum and understanding, with a clarity he had not quite had before, that some things you did not need more information to decide. He decided. Reginald had been Solomon's financial advisor for 9 years, brought in initially to help structure the business entity when Solomon had incorporated his electrical outfit, and kept because he was the kind of man who read every line before he signed and asked the questions most people were too embarrassed to ask. He was 63, and he had worked with a lot of people who underestimated their own position, and he had made it his professional habit to correct that whenever possible. Solomon sat across from him Monday morning in a small conference room on Charlotte Avenue and listened to the audit summary. "The business has been clean," Reginald said. "Consistent growth, 5 years of net positive. The operating account is healthy. The reserve fund is where we talked about getting it." He set the folder down. "The question you asked me 18 months ago about the holding structure, I think we're ready to move on that. Before the filing? Way before. If we establish the holding company first, the business assets are protected from any marital claim from the filing date forward. Anything built before the marriage, your tools, the truck, the equipment, that's already separately titled. The business itself, because she was never a partner or named in the incorporation, is a separate matter. But the holding structure cleans it up definitively. Solomon had spent 15 years learning that the places you couldn't see were the places that determined everything. You could read a panel schedule all day and miss the single junction in the crawl space where someone had done bad work 20 years ago, work that would eventually arc and fail and take the whole circuit down. He had been reading this particular circuit for longer than Vanessa knew. "The operating account," he said. "Run me through the 3-year picture." Reginald walked him through it. The numbers were not modest. The electrical business had grown in the years since incorporation through a combination of commercial contract work and a reputation in the historic renovation market. Nashville was full of buildings that needed the kind of patient, detailed electrical work that most outfits didn't want to do. And Solomon had built a specialty in it. His 4-man crew was fully employed year-round. The reserve fund he and Reginald had been quietly building for 3 years in a business account in the company's name stood at $214,000. Vanessa had never asked about the business in any detail. She knew he ran a small electrical company. She did not know what small meant in practice. She had decided years ago what kind of man he was, and she had stopped updating the picture. Reginald looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How long have you known that the marriage was over? That you were being underestimated?" Solomon was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a delivery truck was double-parked on Charlotte Avenue, hazards blinking. He watched it. "Long enough," he said. Reginald closed the folder. "I'll have the holding company papers ready by Thursday." From Reginald's office, Solomon drove east to a neighborhood in Madison where his grandmother's oldest friend, a woman named Claudette, lived in the house she'd owned since 1971. Claudette was 77 and had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired, and she knew more about how things actually worked. Legal things, financial things, the machinery of consequence, than most people with formal titles. She also knew Solomon better than almost anyone living. She made him lunch. She listened to everything, including the dinner. When he got to the part about the parking lot, she shook her head slowly, not with sympathy, but with recognition. "That woman has been telling you who she is for a while now," Claudette said. "You just kept giving her the benefit of the doubt. I know. Some people read quiet as nothing." She refilled his sweet tea. "They find out eventually." Solomon told her about the investment account. In the past 2 years, Vanessa had been directing a portion of her income specifically, not the shared household expenses which Solomon covered in full, into what she described as a personal investment account she was building for their future. She had mentioned it 3 times in passing and shown him nothing concrete. The account, Solomon had learned from a routine review of the joint financial records he had access to as her spouse, was real. It held, as of last month, $41,000. What it was not was intended for their future. The account was in Vanessa's name only and had been flagged in the records with a beneficiary designation she had added 6 months ago. The beneficiary was not Solomon. It was her sister's address, used as a proxy. Claudette set down her glass. "She's been building an exit," she said. "For at least 2 years," Solomon said. "And the promotion, the one you helped her get." Solomon had, 3 years earlier, put in a direct call to a former client, a senior partner at the firm that eventually hired Vanessa, and spoken on her behalf. He had not told Vanessa he'd done this. He had done it because he loved her. He had done it the way he did most things, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement. Claudette looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen table. The afternoon light was coming in through the curtains she'd had up since before Solomon was born. "You know what gets me," she said finally. "She's been mapping your worth in dollars for 2 years. And the whole time, what actually made her worth something, that job, that salary, that office she's getting her photograph taken in front of, that came from you. From a phone call nobody heard. She paused. She was spending the money from a foundation she didn't know you'd built. Solomon said nothing. Claudette was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what your grandmother used to say. Silence is not the same as empty." "No," Claudette said. "It is not." He went home that evening and watched television and answered when spoken to and was, to all visible observation, the same man he had always been. Vanessa made dinner and told him about an account she was pitching at work, and he asked one or two questions, and she seemed pleased that he was engaged, and he let her have that. He was not performing cruelty. He was simply in the last weeks of a structure he had already decided to take down, and a good electrician did not cut power before the replacement was wired in. 2 days later, he came home to find Vanessa on the phone in the bedroom, door mostly closed, her voice low and fast in the way it went when she was managing rather than conversing. He walked past the door. He did not stop. He did not need to hear it to know what it was. He made himself a cup of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened the folder on his laptop and read through the documentation one final time, start to finish, the way you read a completed wiring diagram before you turned the breaker on, not looking for new information, just confirming the accuracy of what was already there. It was accurate. He closed the laptop. He washed the mug. He went to bed. He had already spoken to a family law attorney, a woman named Beverly Marsh who practiced family and financial law in Midtown and had been recommended by Claudette, and had retained her that same Monday before Reginald's meeting, before he drove to Madison, before any of it. The paperwork was in motion. The holding company would be established by Thursday. The filing would follow the following week. He had done all of this in a single day, without announcement, without drama, without a single voice raised. The way you wired a building, from the panel outward, one circuit at a time, until every room had light. Preparation is the work. He filed on a Friday. Vanessa was served the following Monday morning, at her office, by a process server Beverly had instructed with specific timing. Solomon had not told her it was coming. He had not given her a warning conversation, not a raised voice, not a confrontation in the kitchen. He had not needed to. She called him 3 times in the 40 minutes after service. He did not answer. She was at the apartment when he arrived home that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the papers in front of her, her work blazer still on, her face doing something complicated. There was a man seated across from her, not a lawyer, not a friend, but her brother Devin, who had driven over from Murfreesboro and who Solomon respected independently of this situation. On the table beside the divorce papers was a second document. Beverly had placed one additional item in the filing, one that Solomon had considered carefully before authorizing. A written account prepared by his former client, the senior partner who had hired Vanessa, of the phone call Solomon had made 3 years ago on her behalf. Not legally required, Beverly had included it as part of the financial disclosure, because it established clearly that the job which had funded Vanessa's personal exit account, the job that had produced the promotion she had leveraged at the dinner table to dismiss him, the job that had become the platform from which she announced he was her worst decision, that job existed because of a quiet, unannounced call from the man she had decided was nothing. "You filed without saying anything to me." "Yes, you didn't even give me a chance to. The dinner was the chance," he said. Not loudly, not with anger, just as a statement of sequence. "You've had a lot of chances." She pushed the papers across the table. "What is this holding company?" Beverly had prepared him for this question. "That's my business structure," he said. It's been established legally and correctly. Your attorney can review it. Solomon. Her voice changed. The practiced control slipped into something that might have been genuine or might have been tactical. He had learned, too late and then just in time, that he could not always tell the difference with her. We can talk about this. We can figure out the $41,000 in your personal account, he said. She stopped. The beneficiary designation you filed 6 months ago. He set his keys on the counter. The exit you've been building. He was not accusatory. He was simply reading the circuit, describing what was there, not assigning it a temperature. I don't need a conversation about what it means. I can read a schematic. Devon, to his credit, said nothing. Vanessa looked at her hands. Then she looked at the second document, the letter from the senior partner, already face up on the table, beside the divorce papers. Solomon watched her read it. He watched the sentence about the phone call land. He watched her understand, for the first time in 3 years, what had actually happened. That the job she had used to build her exit, the income that filled the secret account, the promotion she had turned into a punchline at his expense, all of it had been quietly made possible by the man she had decided was nothing. She set the letter down. Devon looked at his sister once. He stood slowly and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Then he looked at Solomon, not with reproach, not with apology, but with the particular nod of a man who had watched something coming from a distance and understood, now, the full shape of what it was. He walked past Solomon on his way out and did not speak. He did not need to. There was a long silence. Solomon picked up his keys from the counter. He had a bag packed. He would stay at Reginald's guest room for the week while Beverly's team managed the logistics. He looked at his wife one final time. She was still at the table, very still, the papers fanned out in front of her, the letter on top. I was never nothing, he said. You just stopped looking. He walked out. The door closed behind him without a sound. Silence is not the same as empty. 10 months had passed like current through clean wire. Solomon was in the new workshop behind the house he'd bought in East Nashville, a 2-bedroom craftsman bungalow he'd purchased at a modest price and was restoring by hand, room by room, on evenings and weekends. He'd started with the electrical, naturally, rewired the whole thing himself, brought every circuit up to code, replaced the panel. Added the outdoor connections for the workshop he'd always wanted. He was now 2 weeks into refinishing the interior hardwood floors, working by hand with a drum sander he'd rented and then bought because renting it a third time made no financial sense. He was not hurrying. The electrical business had, in the months since the divorce, signed 2 new commercial contracts, one with a hotel group doing a mid-rise renovation in the Gulch, one with a historic renovation firm working through a portfolio of Germantown properties that needed exactly the kind of patient, detailed work Solomon had made his name on. Reginald had called the previous month to tell him the reserve fund, between the business account and his personal holdings, had crossed the $300,000 threshold. Solomon had said thank you and asked if there was anything that needed his attention. There was not. There was a woman named Imani who came by on Sunday afternoons sometimes, a general contractor he'd worked alongside on the Germantown build, who had asked him once, in the most direct way imaginable, if he was seeing anyone. She was careful and competent, and she did not perform for him, and she had brought a plant for the porch 3 weeks ago without making anything of it. The plant was doing well. He watered it every other day. The electrical business had continued without disruption. The holding company structure had made the divorce clean, as Reginald had predicted. Vanessa's attorney had contested it briefly, and then dropped the challenge when Beverly's documentation proved airtight. The final decree had been signed in August. Solomon had read it in the parking lot of Beverly's office and then driven to Clarksville, where he had sat for a while at his grandmother's grave and said a few quiet words to no one, and to her specifically. Vanessa was living in a rental in Green Hills. She had not lost the job. The job existed independently of him now, and that was fine. But the promotion had come with a reporting structure that turned out to be demanding in ways she hadn't anticipated. And Solomon had heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that the social circle she'd been cultivating had thinned somewhat since the divorce. He had heard this, and nodded and moved on. He did not know if she had felt the weight of what she'd said at that dinner table. He had decided, deliberately, and with the same methodical care he gave all decisions, that this was no longer his question to carry. The floor sander ran for a while. Then, he turned it off. He stood in the quiet room with the October light coming in through the stripped-down window frame, and he looked at the grain of the wood coming up beneath the work. Warm, tight-grained, old-growth fir. The kind you didn't find in new construction. Somebody had put this floor in a long time ago, and put it in properly, and it had needed only to be seen again, to be right. He would finish it this week. Then the window trim. Then the kitchen. Some things, he thought, just needed someone willing to do the work. He was free. He was solvent. He knew his own value. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.